Hi, this video is about the Chilean military. The Chilean military is of great interest to me, and it's something that I like to hold up as sort of an example. It's an exemplar, if you will, a model for how a country with relatively limited resources, yet that's serious. It's a serious country, it's a sober country, how such a country goes about constructing a completely fit for purpose military that aligns about as closely as any military I can think of that aligns with its strategic interests, its priorities, and its military policy. And this is something that's, unfortunately, it's actually remarkably rare. As I've been arguing in a lot of these videos, what's really important is that for militaries and for countries is that the countries have to have a very clear idea of what they need and what they want to be able to achieve. What kind of military do they want, and why do they want that kind of military? And only if they have clarity with regard to that, then the next step is to build down, to build a force structure and buy equipment that aligns with those priorities and with that clear idea of the kind of military that they actually want. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. And if you feel so inspired, feel free to send me some money using the thanks button here on YouTube. You could also become a member to provide more support. That would guarantee that you are one of the coolest people on the planet. You may also buy me a coffee using the link below in the description. Now, the way I'm going to do this is the following. I'm going to divide this video into several parts. In the first part, I want to talk about Chile's strategic priorities and interests in its military policy. And in the second part, I'm going to provide an overview of the Chilean military, going branch for branch. And then in the third part, I want to try to bring it together and talk about, well, why is it that, having said all the things we've just said above, why is it that Chile really is such a great paragon, if you will, a great model for how to put together a military that aligns quite closely with the country's actual strategic interests and strategic needs. And as usual, I've put timestamps in the description if you want to jump around from place to place. So let's get to it. Part 1, Chile's strategic position and its defense priorities. Why does Chile even have a military? This is an interesting question. In short, the answer is the following: independence, sovereignty, and to some extent tradition. Chile, like most former Spanish colonies in the Americas, had to fight for its independence from Spain, and then to assert its independence vis-a-vis its neighbors, its independence and its sovereignty, while also consolidating its borders and securing natural resources. But what kind of military does Chile need to do that now, today in 2025? Strategically speaking, Chile is sort of like an island. I think Kissinger once called it he likened it to a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. I mean, realistically speaking, it's like an island because, yeah, it's got this gigantic land border with Argentina, but that's mostly the Andean mountain chain. It's very hard to get an army over those mountains. And as a result, it's less vulnerable than one might think given the length of that border. And it's sealed off. And I've actually spent a lot of time in Chile. I know many, many Chileans. I have family in Chile. And when you talk to them, you also get the impression that the rest of the world is far away. You're in this little remote corner of the world. And the rest of the world, in a sense, doesn't matter. Now, this tells us immediately several things. First of all, it tells us that Chile and Chileans, they don't have a view of the world, a strategic culture that involves projecting power or having influence in the region or imposing themselves on anyone. There's no vision of reconquering anything. There's no revisionism that they want to reclaim borders or anything like that. Not at all. But they live in a neighborhood. They have neighbors. Their neighbors aren't necessarily stable. The neighbors also have their own fits of nationalist excessive and whatnot. And every once in a while, threats can emerge. And that this is an issue. And that's really kind of what they're thinking. The Chileans are also worried about the fact that they are a maritime nation, and Chilean government documents make this very clear. The Chileans consider themselves a maritime nation, and they point out that I believe it's something like 80% of Chile's international trade, is over the oceans. Most of that to China, by the way, but it's a maritime nation. It's dependent on ocean trade, and also Chile has a very large exclusive economic zone, which is of great importance to Chile. So what they need is to defend themselves. They need to defend themselves vis-a-vis their neighbors that have some military ability. That fortunately their neighbors are generally peaceful, so it's not a problem, but they've had wars in the past. You could always have wars in the future. Plus, you have to worry about anybody who might encroach on the EEZ. And the magic is, I think that what comes out of this, and what the Chileans understand, or what they've decided to do when thinking about the kind of military force that they actually need, is that the Chileans aim for strategic sufficiency. This is very important. Strategic sufficiency. They need a military that's good enough to assert their interests, to realize their policy. The policy basically being about asserting their independence and sovereignty and protecting the exclusive economic zone. They want to be sufficient to be able to do that. They don't aim for what Americans like to call overmatch. They're not interested in total wars in which they're going to completely overpower people. They're not interested in conducting airborne operations off of Buenos Aires, or they're not going to raid Sao Paulo. They're not going to conquer Peru. It's not about that. It's just strategic sufficiency, and that's how they define the requirements. And as I think we're going to see, everything flows from that, and it flows in a remarkably clear way. Now, just to remind you, just this idea, like most of us probably don't think that Chile has ever been in a war, because probably most people, certainly I'm talking to a North American audience or perhaps a European audience, if I were to ask you to name one Chilean war, you would be, I don't know. They have been at wars, but it hasn't been in a war since the 19th century. The one war to know about, the most important war in Chilean history besides their independence struggle, was the War of the Pacific, which was fought between 1879 and 1884. This is a war between Chile on one side and Bolivia and Peru on the other. It's my understanding that the core of the problem is a conflict over nitrates and resources. Nitrates was very valuable. There are nitrate deposits. There are issues of taxing and import duties and this, that, and the other thing. Whatever. Anyways, that's what the fight was really all about, or the origins of the fight. Chile won this war with some very major implications. The first thing is that Chile conquered the coastal areas of Bolivia. Bolivia wasn't always landlocked. Bolivia used to have a coast, but because of this war, they lost the coastline to Chile. So that's a problem. It also means that even today, Chile's neighbor Bolivia holds a grudge. It's not very happy about this. Another thing that happened is that this war became, it's like a touchstone of Chilean national identity and Chilean nationalism, Chilean patriotism. The war is celebrated. The heroes of the war are celebrated to this day. I've seen them, I follow the Chilean military on social media, and they're always reenacting some of the big battles of it, and they do these sound and light shows, and they've got all these soldiers who are dressed up like they were at the time of the war. It's a big deal, right? And there are songs written about the heroes of the war, like Arturo Prat, the heroic naval commander who fell during the War of the Pacific. And these names are often household names in Chile, and there are statues everywhere. I believe there's a national holiday that's linked to the war. It's really, really very important. If you go to Chile, and it's a great place, first of all, the best reason to go to Chile is the natural beauty. The country is spectacularly beautiful. It's like California, but just like dialed up to 11. Like everything California has, but just more so, or more radically so, with much more juxtapositions. It's incredible. Anyways, if you go to Chile, I highly recommend you go to Valparaiso, which is a fabulous, fabulous city. It's absolutely fascinating. And in Valparaiso, you must go to the Naval Museum, which is excellent. But one of the striking things about the Naval Museum is the Naval Museum is dedicated almost exclusively to the Battle of the Pacific. And in particular, it tells the story of the battle that all of you are familiar with. Well, you would be familiar with it if you were Chilean. The rest of us have no idea what this is. The Battle of Iquique, which was fought in 21 May, 1879. It's a really big deal. But I digress. Since the War of the Pacific, Chile has not been at war. I think they've done some peacekeeping operations like in Haiti and some minor things like that. But by and large, Chilean military has really been more interested, frankly. They've spent a lot of time mucking about in domestic politics, that kind of thing. But Chile has not been at war. The closest Chile got to going to war was in the 1970s during what was called the Beagle Conflict. Yes, the Beagle Conflict. I love this name because it evokes these ideas, these imagery of, you can almost, like, if I knew how to do this, I would create some AI video of these two beagles going at it. It's not about the dogs. It's about the Beagle Channel, which is a channel, a navigable channel in the archipelago that sits below the southern tip of the continent. so that if you want to pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific, these are one of your options for this is a route that you could take to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa. The channel, I believe, is named for HMS Beagle, the Royal Navy's exploration ship that charted those waters back in the day. The situation was tense. Argentina and Chile have never had super great relations, but also during the military dictatorships in both countries, and there's these super nationalist moments, there's a lot of saber rattling, a lot of tensions. And then they were almost at the brink of war, but they were pulled back from the brink of war by none other than the Pope. There was a resolution of this conflict. The Vatican intervened in 1978 and pulled both sides back from the brink, which is great. If you're curious about that period in Chilean history and Argentine history, there happens to be an absolutely phenomenal movie that came out in 2005. It's a Argentine-Chilean production called Mi Mejor Enemigo, My Best Enemy. It's fabulous. The plot involves, it's like a platoon. There's this Chilean unit that's out in the mountains and they're patrolling, but they're totally lost and cut off. And they bump into an Argentine unit that, like them, is totally lost and totally cut off. And neither of them knows where they are and where they are vis-a-vis the border. Neither of them knows if the war they know that the war will break out at any moment, or maybe has already broken out, so they don't know if they should fight these people, what they should do. They were very tense. Then, of course, at some point they get friendly, they trade, and then, of course, at the end, everybody's happy because they play a game of soccer. And in the words of Ted Lasso's immortal Danny Rojas, football is life. But the fact of the matter is that you do have bad relations sometimes between Chile and Argentina. It hasn't led to a war, but there's a reality to it. So, for instance, just a few years later, despite the Vatican intervention in the Beagle Conflict, things are still tense, so much so that when the Falklands War breaks out in 1982, the Chileans provide all sorts of forms of support to the British, including they allowed the British to set up at least one radar station on a mountaintop that gave the British, they were able to see down into Argentina, which gave them early warning intelligence with whenever Argentine planes would take off to conduct raids against the British, which is hugely valuable. The situation, of course, is better now, but today still I think it's safe to say that Chile is right to, while being friendly to its neighbors, to keep a wary eye, to keep an eye out on them, particularly given the fact that they're not so politically stable. And political instability can sometimes lead to erratic foreign policies or perhaps waves of nationalist politics that start banging the drum and, people want to avenge this, that, or the other thing. So that's kind of dangerous. Defending Chile, of course, is an interesting proposition. If you look at the map, here's a map, you'll see that it's a very long, bizarrely long and thin country. Chile is roughly as long as the United States is wide. Think about that. That's absolutely huge. You've got this long land border with Argentina. Thanks to the mountains, however, the threat from Argentina is much less than one might think because there are only certain places that you can cross those mountains. Maybe Hannibal could do it with elephants, but by and large, no. Ultimately, though, the defense, though, is focused more on the north. There, Bolivia and Peru, and also in the south, a bit of Chile that sort of dips under Argentina. There's also concern about the coast and the EEZ because Chile is worried about its exclusive economic zone and it's worried about its dependence on sea lanes. It needs to be able to defend its sea lanes. This is really important. Let's get to part two, an overview of the Chilean military. Chile's military weighs in at about 75 to 80,000 active duty personnel, plus roughly 40 to 50,000 reservists. Chile has conscription, which is interesting, but from what I understand, the usual practice is to rely on volunteers to fill the ranks, and then they only use the conscription thing, a lottery, to fill in whatever gaps that there might exist after they've recruited all the people that they needed to, that they can recruit. The budget is, I would say, fairly healthy for a country that's not in NATO or not threatened the way a NATO country might feel threatened. It's at about 1.6 to 1.8% of GDP, which translates to about $5.1 to $5.5 billion. In the 1990s, by the way, the budget was as high as 3%, and it generally was higher under Pinochet than it was under the subsequent democratic governments, and it peaked at about 8 to 9% in 1982. 1982 was still in the shadow of the Beagle Conflict and the year of the Falklands War. Now, on a side note, and I find this really interesting, these numbers, like when you look up to Chilean defense spending for any of these years, the numbers that you see are actually inaccurate. They are not accurate representations of the money that the country was really spending, or rather, not accurate representations of the amount of money that the Ministry of Defense and the military had at its disposal. Why? Because there was a law called the Copper Law, at least that's how it's referred to. I'm sure that it has a formal name that's different from that. And the Copper Law says this: 10% of the annual revenue generated by Chile's copper industry, and Chile is a huge producer of copper, 10% of the profits of the revenue goes directly to the military, off book, and kind of secret, or at least it's really opaque. So it's very hard to know how much money we're actually talking about. This is all kind of by design. So the amount of money that means, or that the equivalent 10% of the copper revenue, of course, that's a number that's going to vary. Sometimes it's very large, sometimes it's very small, sometimes it's in the middle. It all depends on the fluctuation of global commodity prices and copper prices, and also the ups and downs of Chilean production, etc. So it's not a constant amount of money, but it's potentially a lot of money. In 2019, the Chileans decided to abolish the law. They passed a new law abolishing it. But interestingly enough, they didn't do away with it altogether. They didn't cut the military off altogether from this extra funding. They just decided that, like on this schedule, like every year, they would reduce the percent of the copper revenue that the military would get. And it's not supposed to reach 0% until 2032. Let's go branch by branch, beginning with the Army. The Army has about 45 to 60,000 active duty personnel, which makes it a little bit smaller than it was under Pinochet and even during the Beagle Conflict, which when it was just over 60,000, depending on, at least according to one source that I read. The Army is understandably organized by geographic zone. The country is divided into 6 divisional zones, each with its own Army division, and one of those divisions is a mountain division. Which, by the way, has mules and horses, their own breed. The Chilean Army has its own breed of horse that it uses for this purpose. And they have these cool Italian 105 millimeter howitzers that are designed to be broken down into pieces that can be easily transported by mules. I think it takes like 10 to 15 mules to carry these howitzers. They're not alone in doing this. The Argentines have the same howitzer. They also have mules. I think the Spanish and the Italians do. Also, the Germans and the Austrians also have mules, and for their mountain troops, I don't know if they have this particular howitzer. So this is not a crazy thing to do. So I said that the Chilean army is divided into these kind of divisional. They've cut the country apart into these divisions. The armor, the heavy armor, tanks, is concentrated in the north and in the south, and it's not in the middle. So, for instance, Chile has 4 armored brigades with tanks. 3 of the 4 are in the north at the Peruvian and Bolivian borders, and the remaining one is in the south in the bit of Chile that underhangs Argentina. Now, if we look even more at the force structure, but also the weapon systems, what we can see is that the Chileans have geared their army for peer-to-peer conventional warfare. This is not a coin army. It's not a guerrilla army. They're not interested in bush wars. This is peer-to-peer conventional warfare. This is about being able to fight the Argentines, the Peruvians, the Bolivians, and whoever else might in the region. Also, when you look at that, what you see is that the Chileans aim for, again, strategic sufficiency. This is really very important. They did not create a military that could wipe out their neighbors, that could have overmatch vis-a-vis their neighbors. They created a military that could seriously bleed the nose of their neighbors, that could deter the neighbors from any kind of monkey business. But that's really it. And also, if you look at what they have, none of it can be described as state-of-the-art. None of it's the best of the best or the fanciest. It's all, however, it's mostly secondhand equipment, and it's all, though, equipment that just makes sense because this is good, high-quality stuff. Maybe it's old, maybe it's secondhand, but it's high quality. And you know that this high-quality stuff in good hands with well-trained people, that just works. It can be very, very, very effective. So let's look at what they have. So the Chileans have, for example, 301 main battle tanks. That's a lot, 300 battle tanks. The French have like 210. The British have, I don't know how many they have anymore. I'm not sure they know how many they have anymore. I think it's below 200 now. 300 is a lot. 200 of those are Leopard 4s. that the Chileans bought secondhand from the Dutch army, and 100 of those are Leopard 284s that the Chileans bought secondhand from the German army, and they've modernized both of them. Chile also has 349 armored fighting vehicles. These are YPR 765s. It's a Dutch thing that they bought secondhand from the Dutch and the Belgians. And they have Marder 1A3s that they bought secondhand from the German army. They have a large collection of armored personnel carriers. This is a mix of M113s that I don't know if they bought them new or used. They bought MOAG Piranhas, and they have both the 6x6 and the 8x8 variant. The 8x8 ones are more recent. The 6x6 ones date to the 1980s. I believe the Piranhas are an exception to the rule, that they actually bought the Piranhas new rather than secondhand. They have 48 M109 self-propelled artillery systems that they bought used from Switzerland and from the United States. They have 8 multiple launch rocket systems. These are called LAR-160s. They're Israeli. This is also another exception to the rule. They bought these new from Israel rather than secondhand. And then they have a whole variety of artillery and helicopters and all the usual stuff. Now let's bring this to the Chilean Air Force. Geography alone dictates that Chile needs a relatively large and capable Air Force. You have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of airspace to defend, not just because you've got the whole north and south thing, but you also have the EEZ, so you want to be able to have aircraft that go out into the ocean. Air power is very important. You want to protect the skies. You want to control the skies as much as you can. You also want to be able to facilitate the transport of troops up and down that long coastline. I mean, you can imagine some sort of war scenario where Chile is defending himself from invaders. The Chileans are going to need to shuttle forces up and down the country, and having aircraft is going to be really important for being able to do that, to facilitate that kind of thing in conjunction with the Navy and the Army. So what do they have? So the Air Force has got 12,000 active duty people. Its big ticket items and the real sort of star of the show in the Chilean Air Force are its 46 F-16s. 10 of these Chile bought new from the United States in 2000. I believe these are Block 5052 models. The rest, in other words, the other 30-ish, the Chileans bought used secondhand from the Netherlands. And Chile has updated both of these models. They now sport things like Link 16 data links, which are considered now sort of de rigueur for anybody who wants to do networked warfare, also to interoperate with other people's air forces, etc. They also have light 11 F-5s, the light fighters. Old, yeah, those are old planes, but they have been heavily upgraded with Israeli tech, and such that they can fire, for instance, Israeli Derby missiles, which are beyond visual range. So they're much more capable than you would think. And from what I've read, for all the stuff that they retooled and refitted, and it's that, like the ship of, what is it, Theseus? It's like at some point you have to wonder if there's really any original components in those F-5s at all. The Chileans also have Super Tucanos, about 22 of those. They have 2 E-3 airborne early warning aircraft. That's very important. And they have a healthy stock of tankers, which it's easy to see why that's so important given the size of the country. They've got KC-130s, KC-135s, super important. They have, and then of course, a host of transport aircraft of various kinds. They have UAVs, big UAVs, Hermes 900s, Israeli, and then the Mantis, which I think is a BAE, British kind of thing. The Hermes 900s can be armed, but the Chileans have not armed them, just FYI. And some air defense systems. They've got an unknown number of Mistral, short-range air defense system. They have 3 batteries of medium-range NASAM air defense systems and an unknown number of anti-aircraft guns. Chile's F-16 heavy force doesn't scream modernity. This isn't cutting edge. You don't look at this and think like, oh my God, they could do deep raids and bomb the Iranian nuclear sites or anything like that. No. It's not the latest, greatest, but these are fairly modern, fairly up-to-date planes with fairly up-to-date technology. But remember, the Chileans don't aim for overmatch. They aim for strategic sufficiency. And that, I believe, is precisely what they achieve. Especially if you look at the neighborhood, you could see that they don't really have to worry about the neighbors. Argentina has no modern fighter jets of any kind, so that's not a problem. The Argentines are working on buying 25 secondhand F-16s from Denmark, but those planes also are not as modern as Chile's F-16s. Peru has 8 MiG-29s and 11 Mirage 2000s. They're not particularly up to date. I don't think they modernized the Mirage 2000s at all. They want to replace all of these with something. They're looking at Block 70 F-16s, they're looking at Gripens, they're looking at Rafale. The U.S. has authorized the sale of 12 F-16s, but so far nothing's actually happened. Any of these planes would be probably superior to Chile's F-16s, but not radically so, not game changer so, and Peru really won't have that many of them, so you don't have to worry too much about that. I mean, Bolivia doesn't have any fighter jets or combat jets. It's not an issue. No, they do have some Chinese JL-8 light attack things. It's like ground attack. It's not a thing. Venezuela, whatever, it's far away. They have 24 Su-30s. They have a few F-16s, old F-16s, Block 15 F-16s. From what I read, only some, very few of the Sukhois and very few of the F-16s are actually operational. Colombia has maybe 18 Israeli Kfir jets, which are basically Mirage 5s that have been the Israelis modified. They're fairly modern. They've got modern tech, modern Israeli missiles, but, they're not a super threat to the F-16s. Colombia is now it's about to buy 17 Gripen E planes. And then when that happens, Colombia and Brazil are now going to be at the top of the pack in terms of South American military capabilities, because both of them are going to have Gripen E's, which are excellent planes and really state-of-the-art in many ways. I don't really think Chile needs to worry about this. I mean, Brazil and Colombia, they're far away. They have good relations. This isn't really an issue. Now let's turn to the Chilean Navy, which I think arguably is the most important branch for Chile's overall strategic priorities. Interestingly, because I have a penchant for naval strategy, I looked into this. Is there any kind of doctrine? Do the Chileans have a theory of maritime power? Do they have a doctrine about maritime power and sea power? And it turns out that they do, and that it's heavily influenced by the English naval strategist Julian Corbett, which is not surprising at all. Why Corbett is relevant compared to, let's say, Alfred Thayer Mann, or Mahan, as some people say, is that Mahan was into the idea that you need sea power for sea power's sake, and if you aspire to be a big dog in the world, you have to have big fleets that can go out into the ocean, and then they could seek out the enemy fleets and then destroy the enemy fleets. So you achieve all of your naval objectives simply by destroying the enemy in one big battle. That's kind of the idea. If they don't have a navy anymore, you don't have to worry about them. Corbett had a different view. One of the things is that he thought, well, you don't really need to do that. Plus, how many people can do that? What you need to be able to do is you need to be able to secure your sea lines of communication. There are these sea lines that are important. So the whole ocean isn't important. There's certain lanes or lines that you can draw on the map, that those things are important. You don't need to be able to control them all the time, even if that were possible. You just need to be able to control them some of the time, and you need to be able to keep your adversaries from denying you access to these sea lanes. And when necessary, you need to be able to try to deny the enemy their access to their sea lanes. Also, a big difference is that whereas Alfred Thayer Mann really thought that the Navy was the big show, this is the thing that distinguished the world powers from everybody else, Corbett is more about how naval power is important, but it's secondary to land power, because at the end of the day, wars are decided on land. And the role of the Navy is to support whatever's going on the land. So sea power is not a virtue in and of itself. Chile has a Corbettian approach to naval power, which means you can deduce from this that this calls for a medium-sized fleet that is not going to be capable of projecting power. They're not going to be invading Normandy. They're not going to be running blockades of other countries. They're not going to be able to seek out and destroy enemy fleets. But what they can do is do, I think, a very effective job of securing the coast, securing the EEZ, securing the sea lanes of communication as required. So small, but high-end. Okay, so in real terms, what does this mean? The Navy weighs in at 25,000 active duty people. I want to stress that the Chilean Navy has a reputation, like the Army and the Air Force, of being very professional, very well trained. All of these services, but perhaps especially the Navy, go to great lengths to interoperate with the U.S. Navy, with Americans, joining all these sort of regional exercises and training missions and all that kind of thing. It's not because they are necessarily pro-American, right? So this is not, and they're not really allies of the United States, but more because they are conscious of the fact that, particularly since they haven't fought a war in over 100 years, they need to be able to size themselves up vis-a-vis others. And they also see the United States as the gold standard in terms of the latest thinking about doctrine and tactics and that sort of thing. So the idea is that if you spend as much time as you can interoperating with the Americans, you can learn a lot from them about what you need to do, what you don't need to do, where you fall short, where you don't fall short, that sort of thing. The Navy's major weapon systems include a mix of new and secondhand kit. Most of it is secondhand. Though some of their hulls are thus old because they're buying secondhand stuff, they kitted it out with modern electronics and weapons. So old, yes, but good value. It's like budget. They get it from the sales bin at the Navy store. But then you take the old hulls and you make sure that you retrofit it with lots of modern stuff, the sensors, the radars, the air defense systems, etc. The pride of place goes to Chile's 4 diesel-electric submarines. It has 2 German Type 209 boats that were commissioned in the 1980s, but have been repeatedly modernized, and has 2 state-of-the-art French Scorpion boats, which were delivered in the mid-2000s. Interestingly enough, it bought these submarines new. So both the 209s and the Scorpion, they bought new. I think out of a sense that this is something you don't skimp on. I don't know, but my sense is an understanding that you don't skimp on the submarines. You need to make sure that these things are new. They still have that new submarine smell, and you don't have to deal with any of the problems caused by the previous owner. That's what you want to put money into. So that's what they have. Next comes Chile's frigates. They have 7, I believe. Chile bought these secondhand. 3 of them are ex-Royal Navy Type 23 frigates. 2 are ex-Royal Netherlands Navy frigates of the Karel Doorman class. And 2 are ex-Royal Australian Navy Adelaide class frigates, which I believe is a variant of the United States Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates. By American standards, this is old. This is an old design. But the point is, they're good, they work, and if you kit it out with modern systems, subsystems, it's fine. It's great. To this, we should add they've got several fast attack craft. These are Israeli SAR-4s. They have 8 offshore patrol vessels, 29 patrol boats of various kinds, 4 amphibious warfare ships, including one of these is a former French Navy Foudre, and the other 3 are license-built French-design boats. It's also worth noting that Chile has a fleet of 16 maritime patrol aircraft. 3 of these are P-3 Orions, which are their core long-distance blue water ASW platforms and ISR platforms. And next comes, you have 3 medium-range C-295s, which are new, and also have ASW capabilities. The rest of the fleet I would describe as more like close-in coastal surveillance and inland waterway surveillance, that sort of thing. Now, is all of this enough? Again, yeah, I think so. If you look at the neighbors, you see that the Argentine Navy is in terrible shape. It's got some ships, but they're old. It's in bad shape. The Argentine Navy is not really a threat anymore. They don't actually have any operational submarines anymore, so that's fine. Peru's Navy is perhaps the greater threat. It has 8 aging Lupo Carvajal class frigates armed with anti-ship missiles. They have 6 French-built Velarde class corvettes. These are from the late 1970s. They also have like exocets. They have they're working on replacing the 8 frigates with 6 Hyundai HDF 3200 frigates. I don't know what a HDF 3200 is. It makes me think it's like the Nimbus 2000. Like, ooh. But it's better armed and more capable. And they also operate, and perhaps this is the most scary thing, they have 6 German-built Type 209 subs, which they're busy modernizing. And they're working with Hyundai to develop new subs to replace the 209s. Fortunately, however, Chile and Peru are on good terms. There was an International Court of Justice decision in 2014 that settled a long-standing maritime border dispute. And as far as I know, they get along fine with the Peruvians. They also get along fine with Colombia and Ecuador, both of which have some blue water capabilities. Now, as for the rest of the continent, Venezuela doesn't have a blue water fleet, and it's far away. Brazil's Navy is not that big. It's also far away. And it's kind of hard to imagine there being a big naval fight with countries on the Atlantic side of the continent, except perhaps with Argentina. Probably the biggest concern for Chile in terms of its navy, though, is simply the task of protecting the EEZ and being sort of tough enough and scary enough to deter people from encroaching it. Now, here there's a real problem because the main culprit when it comes to incursions into the EEZ and basically pillaging the fisheries in Chilean waters are the Chinese. The Chinese operate these gigantic and very predatory fishing fleets that routinely just go up to the edge of the line of Chilean waters and Ecuadorian waters and Peruvian waters and frankly everybody else's waters, Mozambique, right? And then very often some of them will cross the line and then the Chileans have to push back. It puts them in a very difficult position because Chile, as strong as they are, sure they could take on the Argentines. You don't want to take on the Chinese. Plus, China is by far Chile's largest trading partner. So it's a very, very difficult situation for Chile. Part 3, putting it all together. The thesis is effectively that what Chile has done is they've built a military that to an exemplary degree represents the kind of how you should do a military, which is that you have a clear idea of what you need and why and what you want to achieve. And then you build a military that fairly strictly aligns to those things. It flows naturally from what you've stated as your policy and your strategic objectives. Thus, they have a force that is lean but professional. Very little of it can be described as state-of-the-art, but all of it is reputable, credible. It's a credible force with credible weapons and credible skills. Most of it is bought secondhand, which brings a high value, but all the things that they buy on the used market are things that make perfect sense. They're not buying capabilities they don't need. They're not falling for the temptation to buy capabilities that are just cool or fancy or I think a lot of militaries are like, oh, that's the machine that goes ping. This is why we're going to spend a fortune on it. There are a lot of countries in Africa, for instance, that buy fighter planes that they don't need. What do they need a MiG-4 or a Sukhoi-4? They don't. And very often it's because there was bribery. Like, somebody in the Ministry of Defense got paid a lot of money under the table in order to broker this deal that then saddles the military with an expensive difficult to maintain capability that they don't need in the first place. The one thing that surprises me is Chile's lack of investment in drones, either surface drones for the ocean or in the air, aerial drones, and because I see them as a no-brainer. Like, it's a cost-effective way to supplement Chile's ISR capabilities and maritime patrol capabilities, but also to add some firepower, which I think would be useful, particularly when you're thinking about mountains, right, where you can't get your howitzers and your tanks to maneuver, but you can zip around in valleys with drones. That could be useful. They haven't really gone that route, and maybe they will now that they too are watching the Ukraine war and drawing their conclusions from that. There has been a lot of chatter on social media about what the Chileans are going to do to replace the F-16s. So some people are like, that'd be cool if Chile became the first country in South America to get F-35s, and of course then there's the usual debate: F-35 versus Rafale versus Gripen E, whatever. I have no idea what the Chileans will buy. The one thing that I feel confident about is that the Chileans are going to, when they make the decision, they're going to go about it in a sober way that is going to weigh costs, calculate costs, capabilities, and they're going to try as best they can to align whatever it is they buy with a clear idea of what they really need. So it's not, what do you want, because it's cool. They're not going to do what the Swiss did. I think to some degree the reason why the Swiss bought the F-35 is because they got a lot of money and it's sort of like, well, if we're going to bother to buy a new fighter plane to replace our old fighter planes, let's just make sure we get the latest, greatest thing. There's a logic to that. If you're the Chileans, you can't do that. You don't have that kind of money. You have to be reasonable. And I trust the Chileans to go about the decision in a very rational and reasonable way. And when the Chileans do, I would urge everybody to watch to see what decision they make and why, because they will not make a rash decision. It's going to be a thoughtful decision, and it would behoove everybody else to try to understand their thinking and why they reach for that rather than that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, please hit like and subscribe. If you look in the description, you are going to see links to my social media. I'm fairly perhaps too active on X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I also have my own website, michaelsherkin.com, and I have a Substack also called Back to America that I try to write for weekly. And and stay tuned. There's more in the pipeline, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.